my friend here, Pasquale, I think, has a question.
Yes. Thank you very much for your talk. I found it very interesting, and there is a lot of things I have to think about. And also thank you because you clarified the mistakes that we usually do in interpreting the score as a direct expression or not of something that it could be not. I have just a couple of questions, if I can. One is about a couple of views of validity that you gave us. I just wrote a couple of sentences from the quotations that you presented. The first is the one by Cronbach and Mill. It was written that test is the sign of an underlying attribute. And similarly, in the one by Borsboom and colleagues, it was written that a test is valid for measuring an attribute if and only if the attribute exists. And the variations of the attribute causally produces variations in the outcome. So my question is, are those views appropriate only when we are considering tests with reflexive indicators of underlying constructs?
Bravissimo. First of all, can you hear me, Pasquale? Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
May I ask you a question so that everyone knows? Are you with an institution or organization? Just so we know who you are, so everybody knows. Gives you an opportunity to brag about your home. Are you at a university or an institute of government?
I work at the University of Padua.
Padua, wonderful. My friends from Padua, wonderful group of mathematical science, where my heart is. I hope to see you folks soon on my next trip. Pasquale, your question is wonderful. So the first question is, are we really in both the Borsboom, Cronbach, and Mill, and really any of these approaches, do they require a reflective view of measurement, as opposed to what we might call a formative view of measurement, to contrast these? Now, just to clarify for everybody, a reflective view of measurement says there's an attribute, there's an unobserved variable, and if you think about it as like a path analysis, here I am, the Calabrese waving his hands. You think of an oval or a circle, and the arrows point away, so that the attribute, if you wish, is the reason for the response. In a formative view, or sometimes called index numbers or other such view, the responses, whatever they are, or scores, are combined in some way, and in a sense, if you wish, one would say the arrows, if you were to draw it via structured equation modeling, Ken Boland does this and others, the arrows go the other way. But the key difference here, Pasquale, right? And stop and jump in if I'm misunderstanding or key difference is that when I'm presented an item, the conceptualization by all of these approaches, and I think it's true of Cronbach and Mill, I think it's true I think it's also true of the work of Danny Borsboom, although I think one could modify Danny's approach. And he may have already done that, as much as I know. He's a brilliant scholar, very productive, the University of Amsterdam. So those approaches really come out of this tradition of factor analysis. Spearman, 1904, right? Not the G-theory intelligence, but the same year, the Tetrad's view of factor analysis. See? So I think those approaches do, and those approaches are driven by this this really conceptualization that has dominated the field. That this underlying attribute is the reason, cause, the source of the item response or the performance.
Mhm.
So I would say, yes, I think it recognizes that if we go to Cronbach-Camille, that's 1955. I mean, that was such psychological measurement in 1955. One could debate, is the MMPI, which Paul Meehl was influenced by and influenced in Minnesota in the 1950s and 40s, is that a measure or is that an index? Index, its dominant use was in sociology and in economics, and index numbers. So the classic example is socioeconomic status versus some psychological attribute. See? E questo è veramente let me speak in English. That is the sort of archetypical contrast. So if socioeconomic status is made up of things like education level, job, income, and other such variables, one would not say my socioeconomic status results in my education level. So in some ways, the dominant psychological view has been to treat behavioral performances as some manifestation of some underlying feature. If one wanted to go back and treat this as purely a behavioral notion, and my friend Brian Maddox, who I don't know if he's still on here, and I will often have this discussion. Why do we keep invoking these underlying things, underlying processes, underlying variables? I live in this imaginary world of the underlying. Now, if you read Adam Smith and the Economists of America and economic history, they also talked about unobserved variables, right? The economic forces is a hand that moves. So physicists talk about underlying variables all the time, right? So what we're talking about here is, does an underlying variable manifest itself, or do observed variables, and if you wish, construct it? Validity theory, as I haven't understood it, Pasquale, is that has really been within this psychological tradition of an underlying variable.
Mhm.
I have to be careful because my intellectual roots go back to, I was a student of Bill Rosenboom at the University of Alberta, philosopher of science, psychologist, very famous, and of Donald Zimmerman, also a very famous psychometrician, philosopher. Both of them came out of a, not too surprising, behavioral tradition, right? First order operant, the Zimmerman effect. He was a behavioral psychologist. Rosenboom, other things, did behavioral work in language as well. So neither of them much liked underlying variables, the way we talk about them. Rosenboom did in terms of exploratory factor analysis and what is factor analysis. But, if we're measuring some behavior of a pigeon, do we really have to ascribe this pigeon some notion of a desire, motivation for doing something? So to answer your question, and I hope I've answered it, is that I think most of psychometric theory is housed within this underlying variable idea. And can I tell you something? I do find it compelling for a lot of our measures. Can I tell you where it's in my face even yesterday? I hope Ben Hives, one of my doctoral student here at UBC, is working with me. Oh, yes, Ben is here, Ben H. Ben is the leader of this project. And it began by Ben saying to me, who's interested in health psychology, exercise psychology, Ben says, Bruno, I have single item measures of physical activity, etc. How do we validate them? Mm-hmm. And it became real interesting because now we had to struggle with what is a psychological measure. So if we ask the question, how many hours did you sleep? Versus how well did you sleep last night? One's psychological, the other isn't? Well, by some definition, one would say yes, because how well I slept is a psychological evaluation of an inner state that reflects, right? How many hours is still psychological in the sense that we know from a cognitive theory that memory, as well as the social psychology of cognition, will affect our response. But somehow those are two contrasts, right? How many hours did you sleep? The typical understanding would say that it is a different kind of psychological measure than how well did you sleep. And there is the cleaved problem. And poor Ben and I have been struggling because we have this small army of brilliant graduate students going through every article of a certain number of years, last 5 years of 3 major journals. And we're reviewing them. And our first problem is something a psychological measure? And we're going crazy. Answer any of your question there?
Yes, you answered it. So thank you very much.
Good. I used, for all the graduate students, I used the classical way of answering a question, which is you keep talking, and then eventually there's something in there. Grazie, Pasquale. Other questions? Speak up, please.
Thank you.
I put you on the spot, Samira. Sono veramente terribile. I'm terrible.
So first of all, I want to thank for this talk, and yes, I was thinking, and I'm thinking. So just one quick thought that I want to share is that my thought at the end of this talk is that we need to so really to move from the idea that we are so if we have one instrument and we say, so usually I want to share this because I think that there are many researchers here that perhaps are not psychometricians, but they are doing research. So in the first steps, usually we say, okay, in Italy, we need an Italian validation of this, the instrument, because in that way we can use a valid instrument and no one will say anything about the strength of the measurement. But after this talk, my first thought was really that we each time we need to focus on these on the inferences that we do, and the problem that I have is that how we can really insert this reasoning in not only in the psychometrician world, but really in research practices and in how we write scientific articles. So this is a big issue, but
I have a few observations. First of all, I want to highlight what I said earlier, that you can get construct underrepresentation or construct irrelevant variance if you move from one cultural setting to another. And I'm going to be influenced by my anthropologist friend, Professor Brian Maddox. I don't know if Brian's on here still. And since my last visit to Milano and to Cattolica, I've become enamored with an anthropologic view and the importance of anthropology. So much so that I married an anthropologist. So that's academic for all the young graduate students. I'm so committed. I married no one smiled. That's okay. I committed to it. And anthropologists would remind me that culture is not just by language and nation. So your claim in this notion of constructs can be moved between cultures, cultural settings can be defined within a community, and we can talk about subcultures and cultural identity within a community. So let me take a step back. So that means we need to worry about this. And my friends in cross-cultural psychology, the late Fons van der Weescher, who I miss dearly, and others, Jose Luis Padilla and others have reminded me of this notion of an emic versus etic notions in cross-cultural psychology. And that is what is common across cultures and what is unique. So what you described is interesting. I've been fascinated by this within the broader context of reproducibility and a generalized science. So the first part about it that you described that was interested to me, Seda, was that you said, which I've seen countless times, we have a measure, we want to get into childhood attachment. What do? We go, we find an typically a US-based American measure of child attachment. That's been the history of psychology in many parts of the world outside of the United States, including Canada. That, how the hell do you tell the difference between me and an American other than I don't carry a gun? Sorry for my American friends on the call. And I have healthcare. That in fact, we go this. And so why do we do it? We do it because of part of it in a paper of mine I talked a few years ago when I was writing about the test standards, the ARA. There is a American cultural imperialism that's, whether they intend to or not, like the entertainment business. Everyone knows who Dua Lipa is, not because she's someone from Latin America, because of her dominant in the American pop music culture. Everybody knows who Bob Sternberg is because Bob Sternberg's personality, his excellent research, his behavior, and is the American cultural imperialism of academia. So we go to it to get some sense of legitimacy, which I think is problematic, but real. See? In Canada, and I know this applies in Italy, but I'll speak Canada. There is, when my colleagues go up for promotion and tenure, I've been at the point in my life now, I've had full professor for a couple of decades now, and they give me these, I earn these titles, distinguished professor, etc. That review, in part, is dominated by how many papers do I publish in American journals. USA, not Canada. In Canada, I live 45 minutes from the border. It's more important that I publish this. So part of it is this, whether it's intended or not, American cultural imperialism that occurs in our community as scholars. I can't change how Canada or Italy does promotion and tenure cases. If I could, let me promise you, I would. But the reality is, this is a very precarious way of doing things. Because even if you look at something like childhood attachment, there's no way that a specialist in developmental psychology can tell me that everything observed in childhood attachment theory found in the US, all of it applies everywhere else in the world that applies in Italy. I would say some of it does not. Some does, some does not. And so this key thing that we talk about in terms of constructs or even formative indicators is that we need to fundamentally ask the question, does this construct travel? Not just is there measurement equivalence, but does the construct travel? So I've done work with some graduate students at UBC, and we've done data where we've collected the same measure in China and in Canada, or in Japan, in Canada, and some social psychological attributes, the construct doesn't travel. There are response styles that are partly culturally driven. In Canada, in the United States, you ask someone, how happy are you? How well are you? They're always the top end of the distribution. If you ask people of the generation of my mama in Southern Italy, on a 5-point scale, Canada, US, most individuals are 4 or 5. People like my mama in that region would be a 1 or a 2. And the first answer is, why do you want to know? Ma che voi? Why are we doing this? Another day. My friends from Israel and I have done this work in Israeli Canadian comparison. So it's the response styles and the construct. And I think this is where things become interesting. But Samita, my answer to this question then becomes, what can we learn in terms of explanatory power about this difference? So if you go forward in my slides, I talk about an ecological model of item responding. Much further down in my slides, what's very interesting in that ecological model of item responding is that there is person, nation, cultural elements. And so the really interesting question is not there are differences, but how do these differences play out in a cognitive, socio-cognitive approaches? Samita, was I close?
Yes.
I've left you more to think about. Good.
Yes. You open even more the what I was saying, because I was a step back, but thank you.